The Ashanti kingdom was sheltered under a thick blanket of rainforest that stretched along the banks of the great river. Tall trees stood like silent guardians, guarding the ancient lands that had been witnessed by many generations. The heart of the kingdom was hidden under the dense crowns of trees. A great palace made of gold and ivory, where the kings of the Ashanti family had ruled for many centuries. King Kofi was the last of this line, a mighty ruler whose hand was strong and his heart was great. But fate, inexorable and ruthless, came to him in the form of a deadly disease. For several weeks, he slowly faded away in front of his queen Nandi, who never. Prince Jabari, their only son and heir, was constantly monitoring his father's condition, hoping for a miracle that did not come. When the last rays of sunset turned the sky bright red, as if nature itself was mourning his passing, King Kofi let out his last sigh. Silence enveloped the palace, as if the whole world was frozen in anticipation. The king's life was no more, but his spirit seemed to remain within these walls, ready to watch what would happen next. Queen Nandi stood by the bedside of her dead husband, her face expressing nothing but calm, almost cold calm. A storm was raging inside her, but she knew she had to hold on. The ancient tradition of the kingdom demanded this. Her fingers, thin and long, held tightly the golden chain on which hung the talisman passed down from generation to generation of queens. This symbol of power and magic was now her burden, her heavy burden. In the next room, in the shadow of a large carved throne, stood Prince Jabari. He was only 25, but his face was full of maturity, forced upon him prematurely by the trials of life. His brown eyes looked with bitter longing at his mother, at her stiff posture, at how she kept her emotions under control, like a caged animal. He understood what lay ahead. Queen Nandi felt her son's gaze, and, without turning around, said softly,
"He's gone, Jabari. The time has come."
Her voice was calm, but every note in it sounded like the ringing of a bell, an echo of the invisible grief filling the space around. Jabari came closer, his footsteps almost noiseless on the marble floor. He stopped beside his mother, his eyes fixed on his father's motionless body, on his face, which still retained a noble expression even in death. Jabari's gaze fell on his mother's face, which stood like a marble statue, beautiful but cold.
What will happen now, Mother? What is it?"
He asked softly. Nandi looked at her son. Her eyes met his gaze. There were no tears in them, only determination and a mysterious calmness that scares more than tears.
"We have to follow the tradition, Jabari. We have no right to violate it."
There was a force in her voice that silenced Jabari. Tradition. The word sounded like a sentence. There was an ancient tradition in the Ashanti kingdom that required the widow of a king to marry her son if he was the sole heir. A tradition that comes from the ancestors, passed down as a sacred law that preserved the magical power and unity of the royal family. It was a tradition that could not be broken if they wanted to maintain power and peace in the kingdom. At such moments, every breath and every look were filled with meaning. Nandi knew that her son understood what it meant to break that vow. The fate of an entire nation was in their hands, and any deviation from tradition could lead to political chaos and a bloody war. As a queen, she couldn't afford to show weakness.
"But that's not right."
Jabari protested softly, his voice full of contradictions, fighting with himself.
"It's unnatural."
Nandi looked at him with a compassion she couldn't afford to express. She knew her son was right. She knew that their tradition was harsh and unfair, but she also understood that within these walls and in this kingdom, ancient laws and rituals mean more than any feelings or moral principles. She knew that the king, despite his death, was still present here, in the form of a spirit who watched them fulfill his last will.
"I understand you, Jabari."
She said softly.
"Mate, but we cannot change what was laid down in our people hundreds of years ago. We are guardians of traditions and customs. If we violate them, we will lose more than we can imagine."
Jabari clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions under control. His eyes were full of pain and misunderstanding. He looked at his mother, at her face, which now seemed alien to him, impenetrable. He knew she was right, but at the same time he couldn't accept this harsh law. The great hall of the palace was filled with the sound of drums announcing the beginning of funeral rites. The sounds of the drums were booming and deep, as if the very heart of the Ashanti kingdom was beating to the beat of these rhythms, plunging everything around into a deep trance. An oppressive feeling hung over the kingdom that night. Every soul knew about the inevitable, but no one dared to say it out loud. The elders gathered in the main hall, their faces stern and unforgiving. They knew that the queen and the prince could not deviate from the customs. They weren't just rules, they were the foundations on which the whole kingdom was based. When darkness enveloped the palace and the night swallowed up all sounds and colors, Nandi and Jabari were left alone in the room where King Kofi spent his last moments. Their souls were filled with pain, but that night they both knew what they had to do. The cruel and ruthless world required them to fulfill an ancient tradition that was supposed to unite them in a new, unnatural union. The majestic trees of the forest outside the window seemed to whisper about what was coming. The stars in the sky twinkled with frightening clarity, as witnesses to what was about to happen. Nandi looked at her son, her gaze full of determination.
We have to do this,
she said, her voice firm but full of hidden pain.
Not for us, but for the kingdom, for the sake of our people.
Jabari nodded, his face as cold as if carved from stone. He knew he had no choice. On this night, under these stars, the fate of the Ashanti kingdom was decided. Tradition, so ancient and inflexible, once again demanded its sacrifice. Their hearts were squeezed with fear and misunderstanding, but they knew they had to take this step. For the sake of the people, for the sake of the world, and for the sake of their father who watched them from heaven. A week has passed since King Kofi's body was interred according to the traditions of the Ashanti kingdom. The nights devastated the palace, filling its walls with the sounds of gloomy ritual chants that echoed through the halls and corridors, reminding everyone of the loss and, at the same time, of the impending ordeal. Time seemed to have stopped, stretching every second into an endless agony of waiting. At the back of the palace, behind heavy wooden doors richly decorated with carvings and gold patterns, were the private chambers of Queen Nandi. Here, away from the gaze of the elders and courtiers, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. Her usually proud posture became more constrained, and her every thought was burdened by the upcoming ritual. A storm of contradictions and feelings raged inside her, which she could not suppress. The ancient tradition required her to obey, but her heart and mind could not agree with it. Every morning, Andy woke up with a heavy heart, feeling like the walls of her own life were becoming a prison, and could not get rid of the thought that her fate had been sealed long ago when she first became queen. Tradition, a word that was like poison and salvation at the same time. She knew that her duty was to continue the royal family, to preserve peace and stability in the kingdom, but deep down, I realized that her duty as a mother would be to protect her son from this terrible ceremony, from this incomprehensible evil hanging over them. Prince Jabari, in turn, felt an increasing estrangement from his mother. He rarely saw her. Their meetings were short and strained, full of unexpressed words and hidden emotions. He wandered the corridors of the palace, trying to find solace in the usual rituals and duties, but none of these activities could drown out the storm that was tearing him apart from the inside. As a child, Jabari always looked at his mother with adoration. She was his mentor, his protector, his world. But now that he was about to marry her, his feelings for her became a painful cocktail of respect, fear, and a strange, uncontrollable desire that he couldn't explain. Tradition dictated that he should look at her as his future wife, but in his eyes she was still a mother, a woman who raised him, taught him love and justice. How could he love her otherwise? One night, when the dark sky was covered with clouds hiding the stars, Jabari could not sleep. He wandered aimlessly through the corridors of the palace until he found himself near his mother's chambers. He stopped in front of the door, hesitating to enter. He knew she wasn't sleeping either. Lately, every time he passed by her room, he could hear her footsteps, like a ghost endlessly pacing back and forth. That night, he decided to knock anyway. The door opened noiselessly, and Nandi stood in front of him, her face pale and her eyes filled with the shadow of an inner struggle. They stared at each other for a few long seconds, and at that moment, a bond arose between them that was more than just blood. It was a bond of people faced with an unbearable choice.
Can't you sleep either?
Jabari asked softly, breaking the silence. Andy nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she was looking for answers to her painful questions there.
It's hard for me, Jabari.
You? She said without looking up.
I'm thinking about your father, about his last will, about our duty to the people. But there's something inside of me. Something doesn't allow me to accept it. I'm torn between duty and what I feel like as a mother.
Jabari stared at her, his heart in pain. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that they would find a way out, but he knew that would be a lie. The truth was much harsher.
We're both trapped.
He said softly, his voice full of bitterness.
A trap created by our ancestors. We can't just walk away from this. We have to do this for the sake of our people.
Andy looked up. There was pain mixed with determination in her eyes. She knew he was right, but realizing this didn't make the task any easier.
You're right,
she said, her voice trembling, but she kept her emotions in check.
Mo. But how do we survive this? How do we live with this after?
These words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, giving no answers, only new questions. They stood in silence, each lost in his own thoughts, not knowing what to say to each other. The next day, preparations for the wedding began. The whole palace was in a fuss. The elders came to discuss the details of the ceremony. Everyone talked about the importance of observing traditions, the need to follow the will of the ancestors, but not a single word touched on the feelings of Jabari or Nandi. They were just pieces in a great game. Their personal suffering didn't matter in the face of the fate of the kingdom, and I couldn't find peace. She felt like she was in a cage, unable to run or breathe. She spent her days in endless thought. Her thoughts were like heavy chains that kept her tied to this terrible ritual. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman she no longer knew. This was not the queen, not the mother she was used to seeing. It was just a shadow, an echo of who she used to be. Jabari was also distraught. He trained with the warriors, trying to exhaust his body to the limit to drown out his thoughts, but no physical pain could compare to the one that tore him apart from the inside. He recalled the days of his childhood, when his mother held his hand, led him through the palace gardens, told stories about his ancestors and their exploits. Now these stories seemed empty and far away to him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, and that face was both a comfort and a torment to him. Then one evening, when the sky turned dark blue and the first stars began to twinkle, Jabari found himself again at the door of her chambers. He didn't know what drove him there. Maybe a desire to see her, to understand how she felt, or maybe just to talk. He knocked, and a moment later the door opened again. Andy stood in front of him in simple linen clothes, her face tired but beautiful in its sad expression. They stared at each other in silence, and there were more words in that silence than in any conversation.
I do not know if I can do this.
No, she whispered at last, her voice barely audible.
How can I be your wife when I'm your mother?
Jabari didn't know what to say. He understood her better than anyone else. He himself felt this agony, this inner contradiction that tormented him every moment.
I don't know either,
he said, his voice trembling.
but we have to try. We must try for the sake of the Father, for the sake of all who believe in us.
Nandi closed her eyes, her shoulders trembling slightly, as if under the weight of an invisible weight. She felt her strength draining away as she slowly turned into an empty shell. She knew she had to be strong, but she didn't know how long she could take it.
I don't want to lose you,
she said, opening her eyes and looking at him with pain.
But I'm afraid I've already lost it.
Jabari took a step forward, his hand slowly rising to touch her shoulder, but he stopped halfway. He couldn't cross that invisible line that separated them. They were so close, but at the same time so far apart. He saw her suffering and felt his own, but he couldn't find a way to bridge the gap between them.
We won't lose each other,
he said softly, his eyes full of determination.
We'll find a way to get through this. We must.
Andy nodded, her eyes glistening with tears that she did not allow herself to shed. She knew he was right. They have to find a way. Must. This night was another long night without sleep. They both sat in their rooms, lost in their thoughts, realizing that an unimaginable ordeal was ahead of them. And in this silence, under the stars that looked at them with cold indifference, they prepared to face their fate face to face. Morning came, and with it came the realization that there was no turning back. They both knew they couldn't escape what was waiting for them. They knew their lives would never be the same. And yet, despite all their fears and doubts, they were ready to take this step for the sake of their people, for the sake of the kingdom, for the sake of an ancient tradition that bound their destinies. It's been days since their last conversation. The Ashanti Palace was slowly sinking into the rhythm of preparations for the inevitable. The drums, which once beat only mourning rhythms, have now been replaced by more complex and solemn motifs, foreshadowing the upcoming wedding of the Queen and the Prince. It seemed that the entire kingdom was sighing, preparing for the changes that this ceremony would bring. But inside the palace there was something else. Nandi and Jabari tried to avoid each other, but every corner of the palace reminded them of what connects them, what awaits them. The Queen spent more time in her chambers or in the conference room, surrounded by elders who discussed the details of the ceremony with fanatical devotion. Jabari, in turn, took refuge in the training room, where he spent hours honing his skills, as if trying to banish all disturbing thoughts from his head. However, neither the physical exertion nor the multitasking of palace affairs could drown out the voice of their hearts. Nandi couldn't stop thinking about Jabari's words. His eyes, full of determination and pain, haunted her every time she closed her own. How can you marry him? How can you marry a son whom she raised, protected, and loved as a mother? These questions tormented her, but there was no answer, only the silence that enveloped her like a dense, suffocating fog. Meanwhile, Jabari felt his feelings for his mother begin to change. In his memories, she was a woman full of life, wisdom, and dignity. But now, when their every glance or casual touch filled him with a strange, forbidden energy, he saw in her not only the queen, not only the mother. In her presence, he began to feel something more, something that aroused an inexplicable excitement in him. This feeling was foreign to him, and he couldn't figure out where it came from. The day came when, according to tradition, the future spouses had to spend time alone in the gardens of the palace to discuss their future and understand each other better. This ancient ritual was meant to strengthen the bond between the bride and groom, but in their case, this ritual seemed to be just another act of desperation. The gardens of the Ashanti Palace were known for their beauty. Magnificent trees, flowering shrubs, fountains, and winding paths created a feeling of secluded paradise. This place has always served as a refuge for Nandi. Here she found peace when she was overwhelmed by emotions. On this day, she stood under the spreading crown of a baobab tree, her arms folded on her chest, her eyes fixed into the distance, where the sun was slowly sinking below the horizon. Jabari approached her quietly, like a shadow, his footsteps barely audible on the soft ground. He stopped a few steps away from her, watching her silhouette illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. In that golden light, she seemed almost mythical, a queen, a goddess, a woman he had never known and had begun to see differently. They stood in silence for a few moments, separated by a short distance, but nevertheless so close that each could hear the other's breathing. This silence was filled with tension that was impossible not to feel. It hung in the air like a thunderstorm, ready to burst at any moment.
I remember my father taking me here when I was young.
Andy finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low but firm, as if she was speaking more for herself than for him.
He told me that here, among the trees and flowers, you can find answers to all questions.
Jabari listened to her, his eyes never leaving her face. He knew these stories. His father often told him about the times when Nandi was just a young princess full of hopes and dreams. But now she seemed completely different to him, a woman he didn't know whom he's just beginning to understand.
And you found your answers. What is it?
He asked softly, taking a step forward. Andy turned around, her eyes meeting his. In their depths, he saw all her pain, her doubts, her struggle. But he also saw something else, a warm, almost imperceptible feeling that she couldn't hide.
Not all of them,
she replied after a pause.
Mel, but some things have become clearer.
Jabari came closer, his heart beating faster. It seemed to him that her every word, every movement meant something. He didn't know how to interpret these moments. How to approach her? How to cross the border that seemed so insurmountable?
And what became clearer? What is it?
he asked, standing so close now that he could feel her breathing. Andy lowered her gaze. Her arms involuntarily closed around her waist, as if protecting her from this strange feeling that arisen between them. She didn't know how to answer. How can I explain what she couldn't understand?
Herself?
Her voice trembled and she paused before speaking again.
Might have to be strong, not only for the people, but also for myself.
Jabari nodded, although her words did not seem to fully clarify the essence of her thoughts for him. He could see that she was struggling, and it only intensified his own feelings. He wanted to touch her, hold her, comfort her. But how could he do that when she was his mother? Slowly, he reached out, touching her shoulder. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent an electric shock through his entire body. He felt her body tremble under his hand and immediately pulled it away, as if he was burned.
I'm sorry.
He said quickly, taking a step back. Nandi looked at him, her eyes full of mixed emotions. She didn't know what to say. This touch was so unexpected, but not unpleasant. It awakened something in her that she hadn't felt since her husband died, something she couldn't explain.
Don't apologize,
she said softly, and her voice was soft, almost gentle.
Mo, we both don't know what to do.
They fell silent again, and the silence was even more intense than before. The sun finally disappeared below the horizon, and the garden was filled with the soft light of the moon. The breeze gently swayed the leaves of the trees, and the silence seemed to sharpen all their senses. Jabari felt his heart pounding in his chest, and at that moment he realized that he could no longer contain his feelings. He took another step forward, reducing the distance between them to a minimum.
Mother, Nandi...
He began but could not continue. The words stuck in his throat, finding no way out. Nandi slowly raised her hand and touched his face. The touch was soft, barely perceptible, but it said more than any words. Jabari felt the warmth spreading through his body, and his heart began to beat even harder. They stood there, looking at each other, in complete silence, which was filled only with their breathing and the beating of their hearts. At that moment, something new arose between them that both of them could not explain, but that they both, I do not know what will happen next,
Nandi said softly,
her voice full of pain and doubt.
But we have to find the strength to go through this together.
Jabari nodded without taking his eyes off her. He knew that this was only the first step towards something unknown, frightening but inevitable. And at that moment, he realized that he was ready to take this step, despite all his doubts and fears. The evening came, which was eagerly awaited by all the inhabitants of the Ashanti kingdom. The majestic halls of the royal palace were decorated with luxurious fabrics, bright flowers and golden garlands that glittered in the light of 1,000 candles. The royal ball, an event that was organized in honor of the upcoming wedding of Queen Nandi and Prince Jabari, was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era, an era that the elders hoped would bring peace and stability to their people. But underneath the bright decorations and loud sounds of joy, there was another story, a story filled with internal conflicts, suffering and inexpressible feelings. Queen Nandi stood at the foot of a large marble flight of stairs overlooking the entire hall. She was wearing a gorgeous dress made of the finest ivory fabric, which accentuated her statuesque figure. She had a crown on her head, a symbol of her power and status, but she felt like a prisoner of her duties. There was a mysterious sadness in her eyes, disguised under a mask of royal pride. She looked at the guests, who were laughing, singing and dancing merrily, but her thoughts were far away from here. Once upon a time, the royal ball was a joyful event for her, a place where she could afford to forget herself in dancing, surrounded by music and light. But that evening, every sound, every laugh, and every look seemed unbearable to her. She knew that all these people had gathered here not for her and Jabari, but for the sake of tradition, in order to preserve the illusion of stability and order in their world. But there was a storm raging in Nandi's heart that no one could see. Prince Jabari stood at the opposite end of the hall, surrounded by courtiers and elders who were eagerly discussing the future of the kingdom, each of them offering their advice and opinions, seemingly vying to show their wisdom and devotion. She was wearing the traditional prince's costume, a long velvet robe and a golden turban decorated with precious stones. But his thoughts were far from political conversations and upcoming commitments. He caught every movement of his mother, every change in her expression. Unable to look away, Jabari saw Nandi standing motionless, her figure standing out against the background of the magnificent hall. Her eyes, staring into the void, seemed so far away and inaccessible. He felt something tighten in his chest every time their gazes crossed. This ball, which was supposed to be a celebration, was a test for him. His inner feelings were growing by the minute, and he knew that his feelings for his mother had changed. He couldn't look at her the way he used to. The music changed, and the drums began to sound louder, calling the guests to the dance floor. Nandi and Jabari were to open the ball with a dance, as required by custom. Their steps were slow and confident, but each step was difficult for them. Under the gazes of the audience, they began to move to the beat of the music. It was a traditional dance performed only by royalty, a dance symbolizing the harmony and unity of the ruling dynasty. The whirlwind of colors, movement, smiles, and fake fun surrounded them, as if the whole world was trying to hide their true feelings. Dancing couples circled around them, creating the illusion of continuous movement and life. But for Nandi and Jabari, this dance was more than just a ritual. He was a manifestation of their inner struggle, their attempt to cope with the feelings that suddenly overwhelmed them both. Andy felt his hand on her waist, his breath on her face, and it awakened in her a strange feeling that she could not explain. She could feel her body reacting to his presence, and that reaction was both frightening and exciting. Her fingers trembled when she touched his shoulder, and every movement was difficult for her. She tried not to look into his eyes, afraid that in his gaze she would see her reflection, her own doubts and fears. Jabari, in turn, felt his heart begin to beat faster with each of her movements. Her closeness was painful for him. Her warmth made him forget about everything that was right and wrong. He saw how she was trying to hold herself with dignity, but he also saw her inner struggle, her fear of what lay ahead, and this further inflamed his feelings, making him want her, despite all the prohibitions and norms. The music gradually slowed down. Its rhythm became softer and deeper, as if nature itself was adjusting to the atmosphere of this evening. Their movements became slower, and they no longer seemed to follow the rhythm, but moved of their own free will, at their own pace. Their bodies began to synchronize, and at that moment they were not just mother and son, but two souls entangled in a complex network of feelings and responsibilities. At some points they stopped, their foreheads almost touching. Nandi closed her eyes. Her breathing quickened and her hands tightened on Jabari's shoulders. She couldn't hold back her feelings anymore. This dance, this closeness, awakened something in her that she had been hiding for a long time. She could feel his arms wrapped around her waist, and his breathing was getting heavier. They were standing in the center of the hall, surrounded by dancing couples, but for them the world seemed to have stopped. There was something profound and unfathomable in this tacit admission of their pain and passion. Suddenly, the lights in the hall dimmed and the candlelight flickered, creating a sense of mystery and intrigue. It was time for the next part of the ceremony, the moment when the future spouses had to say their vows to each other. Nandi and Jabari approached the central pedestal, which was decorated with flowers and candles. Their steps were slow and confident. There was nothing in their gazes but determination and understanding of what awaits them next. The crowd around fell silent, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Everyone held their breath as they watched the Queen and the Prince standing side by side, their hands intertwined, as required by custom. This moment was supposed to be a symbol of their union, their willingness to take on the burden of government and preserve the traditions of the kingdom. But there was a storm raging inside both of them that they couldn't put into words. Andy closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer, addressed to the ancestors, to the spirits who watched them. She asked for strength, for wisdom, and for the ability to accept what was about to happen. She felt her body tremble, but her spirit remained strong. She knew that she had to be strong, that she had to fulfill her role. Despite all the internal contradictions, Jabari stood next to her, his gaze directed forward at the crowd, but his thoughts were focused only on her. He could feel her every movement, her every breath. He knew that she was struggling with the same feelings as he was. He knew that their bond had become more than just a blood bond. And at that moment, he realized that he was ready to accept his fate, whatever it was. When the moment came for the vows to be pronounced, Nandi opened her eyes and looked directly at him. There was something new in her gaze, something he had never seen before. It was the look of a woman who had made her decision, who was ready to face her fate face to face. She took his hand, her touch firm and sure. After the royal ball, when dancing and vows were left behind, night fell on the Ashanti kingdom with unexpected silence. The stars shone brightly, as if watching what was happening in the shadow of the palace, and the moon poured its soft light on the gardens surrounding the residence of the kings. The night was extremely quiet, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. But the royal gardens, surrounded by greenery and exotic flowers, were beautiful in the moonlight. The tall trees, under which the silvery light glided, stood like guardians guarding the secrets of this ancient place. Here, amidst the fragrant flowers and the sounds of night birds, time itself seemed to slow down. At this hour, when the world seemed to stand still, the gardens became a refuge for those who sought solitude and peace. Nandi walked slowly along the winding path, her footsteps soft, almost noiseless on the dew-wet grass. She stopped under a tall baobab tree that had been standing here for hundreds of years, sheltering her from the whole world with its mighty branches. A light breeze stirred her dress, and she closed her eyes, trying to get rid of the thoughts that were bothering her. The evening at the ball reawakened in her those feelings that she had been trying to suppress for so long. She remembered how they danced with Jabari, how his hands touched her waist, how his gaze penetrated to the very depths of her soul. She felt her heart beat faster at the memory. These were not just memories. They were images that stuck in her mind, becoming a part of herself. She struggled with herself, with these new, frightening feelings that awakened something forbidden in her, but at the same time irresistibly attractive. The shadows in the garden swayed with the wind, creating the illusion of movement around her. She could feel the movement engulfing her, drawing her into its dance. At that moment, it seemed that nature itself knew about her inner struggle and reflected it in every rustle of leaves. Nandi took a deep breath. Her heart was beating faster and faster, and she felt a strange, almost hypnotic state take hold of her. Jabari, who was watching her from the shadows, was no less excited. He came here, to this quiet garden, to find answers to his own questions, to understand what was happening to him. But when he saw Nandi standing under the baobab, his thoughts started to get confused again. He watched the moonlight gently slide over her face, emphasizing every feature, every movement of her lips as she inhaled the night air. He could feel a wave of feelings rising in him that he couldn't control. Her presence filled him with a strange mixture of calm and anxiety, fear and desire. He took a slow step forward. His legs seemed to carry him to her, and he knew that at this moment his life would never be the same. Andy sensed his presence without seeing him. She knew he was there. She knew he was looking at her, and that knowledge was both a comfort and a challenge to her. She did not turn around, did not move. Her body was frozen in tension, like a taut string, ready to break at any moment. She heard his footsteps, quiet but confident, and her heart pounded even harder as he came closer. At that moment, something invisible appeared between them, something that connected them, like a thread stretched through their entire lives, linking their destinies in this place. At this time, they stood a few steps away from each other, not saying a word, but understanding each other without words. The silence of the night became their common language, their common confession of what could not be expressed in words. The moon shone on their faces, and in that soft light their eyes met. Jabari's gaze was full of the strength and determination with which he tried to hide his feelings, but there was also a tenderness in that look that he couldn't hide. Andy gave him a look full of mixed emotions, fear, pain, but also something more, something she couldn't explain. They were like two parts of one whole, like two mirrors reflecting each other. Time passed, but for them it seemed to have stopped. They stood in silence, and that silence spoke for both of them. She talked about the feelings they couldn't admit, the bond they couldn't break. They both knew that this night would change everything, that nothing would ever be the same again. But at this moment, under the starry sky, they were not thinking about the future. They just stood there, allowing themselves to be who they are. Nandi took a step forward, her hands involuntarily raised to his face, but she stopped, not daring to touch. She could feel her body trembling, her heart beating in her chest, but she knew she had to take this step. Her fingers rested on his cheek, and at that moment she felt a strange, almost forgotten feeling of intimacy come over her, as if they were a child and a mother again. But at the same time, something much more. Jabari didn't pull away, he just closed his eyes, feeling her touch like a warm wave rolling over him. He felt her warmth, her tenderness, her struggle, and he understood that this night was a test for both of them, a test that they had to go through together, despite all their fears and doubts. They stood for so long, immersed in silence and their own thoughts, until the night began to give way to dawn. The light of the moon gradually faded, giving way to the first light of day, but they did not move. They knew that the time they spent here was their only time, the time when they could be themselves, when they could allow themselves to feel what they felt. In the end, Nandi slowly withdrew her hand. Her eyes were full of tears that she couldn't hold back anymore. She took a step back, her heart heavy with feelings she couldn't understand, but she knew she had to be strong. She turned and walked slowly back to the palace, leaving Jabari standing under the baobab, his eyes following her until she disappeared into the shadows. Jabari stayed in the garden long after she left. His thoughts were full of mixed feelings. His heart was heavy. He knew that this moment was important to both of them, that this night was their last night, when they could be free from responsibilities and obligations. He knew that they had both taken a step towards something new, something unknown, but he did not know what it would mean for them in the future. As the sun began to rise, he slowly left the garden, his steps heavy and full of thought. He knew that there were even more trials ahead of them, even more difficulties, but he also knew that they could get through it if they were together, and in this he found solace, found the strength that would lead him forward. Dawn broke on the Ashanti kingdom, illuminating the horizon with a soft golden light that filtered through the dense crowns of the trees surrounding the palace. This day was special. Since the morning, the entire palace has been enveloped in an atmosphere of intense expectation. The servants were bustling, the elders were taking their places, and even the birds seemed to have fallen silent, sensing the significance of what was happening. It was the day of the wedding, the day when Queen Nandi and Prince Jabari were to join the knot, as required by ancient tradition. It was a day when everything had to change. The magnificent palace halls have been transformed into temples of ritual and grandeur. The walls were decorated with colorful fabrics, decorated with traditional patterns and symbols, telling the stories of the ancestors and their deeds. The golden garlands hung from the vaults of the high ceilings, shining in the light of the morning sun that penetrated through the stained glass windows. The scents of incense and fresh flowers filled the air, mixing with the soft hum of conversations from courtiers and guests who had come from all over the kingdom to witness the event. Queen Nandi was preparing in her chambers. Her maids deftly wove complex braids, weaving gold threads and pearls into them, giving her appearance even greater grandeur and nobility. Her dress, made of the finest silk the color of the morning sky, was decorated with delicate embroidery, depicting the symbols of their people, symbols of strength, wisdom, and eternal life. But behind all this splendor, her confusion was hidden. She stared at her reflection in the large mirror, trying to see herself as a queen, as the leader of her people, but all she saw was a woman gripped by contradictions and hidden fear. Every movement, every breath reminded her of the events of last night in the gardens. The silent night, the stars that seemed too close, their touches and glances that said more than any words. She remembered how her heart was pounding when Jabari came closer, how her body trembled at his touch. And now that she was going to marry him, her mind was filled with questions that she couldn't find answers to. At the same time, Prince Jabari was in another wing of the palace, preparing for the ceremony. He was wearing a traditional outfit, a red robe symbolizing power and courage, decorated with gold threads and precious stones that sparkled in the torchlight. Elders were bustling around him, giving final instructions and rituals. But his thoughts were far from these formalities. He thought about his mother, about how she looked in the gardens under the moonlight, about her quiet confession, not expressed in words, but read in her eyes. He knew that today's ceremony would be a turning point in their lives. It was a step they had to take for the sake of their people, for the sake of preserving traditions and stability in the kingdom. But he also understood that with this step, their relationship would change forever. There was no way back. There was no way to go back to what it was before. And although he was ready to accept his fate, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that they shared something more than just duty. Finally, the moment that everyone has been waiting for has arrived. The drums began to play a slow, solemn rhythm, announcing the beginning of the ceremony. The guests took their seats in the great hall. Their eyes were fixed on the central alley, along which the queen and the prince were to pass. The air was filled with tension and expectation. Every breath, every whisper heightened the sense of impending. She appeared first. She walked slowly, her head was held high, and her posture was straight and proud. Her steps were confident, but each step was difficult for her. She felt like hundreds of eyes were looking at her as she was being evaluated and judged, but she also knew that her people expected strength and determination from her, and she couldn't let them down. Her heart was beating faster with every step, but she kept walking, her gaze fixed forward to the throne, to her future. Jabari appeared shortly after her. His face was calm, but his eyes reflected the inner tension. He walked straight, his steps were firm, but at the same time cautious. He knew that something inevitable was ahead of him, something he had been preparing for, but could not fully accept. As he approached his mother, his heart stopped for a moment. Their eyes met, and at that moment he realized that they were both in this together, that they were both ready to accept their fate, despite all their fears and doubts. The ceremony began with traditional chants and dances symbolizing unity and harmony. The elders read ancient texts, addressing the ancestors, asking for their blessings on this union. They stood side by side, Nandi and Jabari, their hands held together with a ritual ribbon, a symbol of their new union. The ribbon was made of the finest silk, but it seemed heavy like metal, like a load that they now had to carry together. The whole ceremony was carefully arranged. Every movement, every word was filled with meaning. But for Nandi and Jabari, it all seemed like a dream, something remote and unreal. They stood in front of their people, in front of their ancestors, knowing that this moment would change their lives forever. They both felt the ground getting harder under their feet as their hearts began to beat in unison, despite all the doubts and fears. When it came time to say the vows, Nandi felt her throat go dry. She knew the words, she knew what she had to say, but her voice seemed to be stuck in her throat. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts, trying to find the strength. And then opening her eyes, she looked at Jabari, at his face full of determination and confusion. And at that moment, she found what she was looking for. Her words were as firm and confident as a stone. She talked about duty, about love for her people, about devotion to traditions. But she also talked about strength, about the courage to go forward despite fears and doubts. Her voice sounded like it had never sounded before, like the voice of a woman who knew what she had to do and was ready to do it no matter what. Jabari, in turn, spoke with the same fire and passion. He spoke of his duty as a prince, as an heir, but also as a man who is ready to take responsibility for his people and for his queen. He spoke about unity, about the need to be strong together in order to overcome all the challenges that lie ahead. And when his voice stopped, there was silence in the hall, filled with the power of their words and their promises. When the ceremony came to an end and the ritual ribbon was untied, they stood before their people as a new alliance. The people cheered, and the drums began to sound again. Their rhythm became faster, urging everyone to join in the celebration. Nandi and Jabari stood holding each other's hands, their gazes fixed forward into the future that now belonged to both of them. They knew that challenges lay ahead, that their union would not be easy, but they also knew that together they could overcome everything. This day marked the beginning of a new chapter for them, for their people, for their kingdom. And in this new order, they found a new strength, a new determination to move forward no matter what. When evening fell on the Ashanti kingdom and the sun began to sink below the horizon, Nandi and Jabari were left alone in their chambers. They stared at each other in silence, their hearts beating in unison, their souls full of determination. They knew that their journey was just beginning, but they also knew that they were ready to accept it, no matter how difficult it was. Celebrations continued outside the palace, with people singing and dancing, marking the beginning of a new era. But inside the palace, in the silence of their chambers, Nandi and Jabari found their world, their refuge, their understanding of what it means to be together, what it means to follow the path that was destined for them. And at that moment, they realized that now they are connected forever, like a queen and a prince, like a mother and son, like two people who are ready to accept their fate and walk along it together.